Hi, I'm Todd Thompson, President and CEO of the Greater Pensacola Chamber of Commerce, and I want to thank you for watching this legislative wrap-up today. At the Chamber, we want to make sure you stay connected during these times and you're getting information that's going to be relevant to you and your business. I want to thank our sponsors today. Centennial Bank is our gold sponsor. Appreciate the great work they're doing with the Paycheck Protection Program to get loans to our small businesses, get their workers paid, keep our economy going. I also want to thank our table sponsors, Cox Communication, Baptist Healthcare, the Institute for Women in Politics, and Bill Sheffield Realty. Thank you so much for your support in this time, and we look forward to seeing you again real soon. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today as we recap the 2020 legislative session. And although we're saddened that we cannot be together in one room today enjoying a nice breakfast, we're thankful for the opportunity to still connect with you online and provide you a recap of the 2020 legislative session. As you know, the Greater Pensacola Chamber of Commerce establishes legislative priorities every year. This list of legislative priorities are based on the Policy Committee's assessment of the business climate here in Northwest Florida and their needs. This year, the three areas of emphasis for us were education, healthcare, and water quality. Today, we'll hear from Christopher Dawson, a lawyer and lobbyist with GrayRobinson, as he recaps those areas of interest and also provides us a summary of the successes and losses of the 2020 session. First, we want to say a huge thank you to our gold sponsor, Centennial Bank. Centennial Bank, thank you for sponsoring today's event and making it possible. And before we get started, we are going to hear from their market president, James Hausman.
Good morning. I'm James Hausman, the market president for Centennial Bank. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Greater Pensacola Chamber's 2020 legislative update. I wish we were being together in a different setting right now, and this was being held somewhere where we could all get together and enjoy each other's company like we so often do. But unfortunately, under these circumstances, we have to do this via video. And I would just like to applaud the Chamber for continuing on with this event and this venue and putting this out for our membership. I think it's fantastic what they've done over the past 3 weeks, and I can't give them enough credit for keeping their members updated, the continuous emails, and letting us all know what's going on within our community. Although Centennial is a larger publicly traded bank, it's times like this where I'm extremely proud of our local staff in this market and across North Florida for what we do on a daily basis. Our staff has been working tirelessly day and night for over a week now processing PPP loans. We're there first thing in the morning, we're there on the weekends, and we're there till midnight at night, hoping that we can get everything taken care of for our customers. It's efforts like that that have led Centennial to be the #1 rated bank in the country by Forbes for 2 of the last 3 years. What's great about this community is that I know it's not just Centennial Bank out there that's putting these efforts forward. It's a conglomerate of banks that are doing the exact same thing. We have medical personnel that is working late. We have first responders that are putting themselves at risk by going into risky situations. And I can't thank our entire community enough for what they do on a daily basis to help keep this community safe and help us prosper financially. It's with great pleasure that I introduce our speaker to you today, GrayRobinson. They're going to give us some great updates on the legislative session, what came out of that, and things we might look for going forward. I hope next year we all get a chance to be in person together and hear this update, and I'm quite certain the feedback we're going to get from GrayRobinson will be different next year than it is this year. I hope everybody is safe, healthy, and I wish you and your families the best. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for a session recap of the 2020 regular session of the Florida Legislature. Chris Dawson with GrayRobinson, and it's a pleasure to be with our good friends at the Pensacola Chamber this morning. We absolutely love giving this session recap. I think this is our 5th or 6th year with the Chamber now, giving this presentation. Of course, it's more fun to be in person with you all and to do the Gopher Club breakfast. And we also sneak in a little bit of time on the beautiful beaches up there in Pensacola. But unfortunately, it's a little bit different this year. But we thank the Chamber for having us and having this creativity to allow us to do a webinar with all of you this morning. We'll get started on what happened during the legislative session, and I'll introduce some of my teammates here with GrayRobinson as well, who will be going through the presentation with me. But first, of course, the big elephant in the room is COVID-19. So I wanted to provide a really quick update on what the state government is doing to address that crisis. Of course, we are still under a statewide stay-at-home order that runs through the end of the month. Governor DeSantis also extended the vacation rentals ban on Friday to the end of the month, so no vacation can operate in the state for another 2 weeks. Though the tide is turning a little bit. We have seen the curve flattening across the state, showing that some of the stay-at-home measures are working. Particularly outside of South Florida, the numbers are looking pretty good. In Orange County, Duval County, the curve does seem to be flattening there. South Florida continues to be the epicenter, but even there, they are seeing some improvement. And so I wanted to share with you all that yesterday a task force was created that will look at reopening Florida's economy. It's called the Task Force to Restore Economic Strength Through Employment and Tourism. As an acronym, that stands for RESET. So this will be called the RESET Committee. Someone's more creative than I am. And it's being co-chaired by 4 statewide trade associations, the Associated Industries of Florida, Florida Retail Federation, the Florida chapter of the National Federation of Independent Businesses, and the Florida Restaurant and Lodging Association. And so that committee, co-chaired by those 4 organizations, and then the full membership is 31 different associations from across the state, touching all major sectors of Florida's economy, will begin to start looking at what the post-COVID-19 lockdown world looks like, if you will. And so that will be forthcoming. But now we're going to jump into our presentation and talk about the 2020 regular session, which was relatively COVID-19 free until the very end. And we'll talk a little bit about how the virus changed the course of session and what we may see moving forward. But with that, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Katie Fleury, with GrayRobinson down here in Orlando with me, and she is going to start the presentation. Before she does, I'll tee it up for you all. You'll see the basketball in your screen there. We are huge March Madness fans here at GrayRobinson, and we have been devastated by the fact that obviously there was no March Madness tournament this year. So what we have done is tailored our session presentation into a little bit of a March Madness theme so that you can get that little bit of taste of what you may have missed. For those of us here on the team, our Gators probably weren't going to do that well anyway, so we're just going to fast forward to March Madness 2021 when the Gators are going to advance down the ranks. But with that, I'll kick it off to Katie, and she's going to take us through the top seeds from this year's session.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, everyone in Pensacola. Thanks so much for being with us. Top seeds, we have Governor Ron DeSantis, who recently, last month, welcomed a new baby girl, the Speaker of the House, his last year, Jose Oliva, and President Bill Galvano. That was our core leadership. Then we have the Lieutenant Governor, Jeanette Nunez. As you may remember, she's a former House member who lives in Miami. And our cabinet members, Attorney General Ashley Moody, our CFO is Jimmy Petronis, and our Agriculture Commissioner is Nikki Freed. Our Speaker Designate is Rep. Chris Sproul. So this year he will be taking over as the Speaker of the House. And some of his leadership, our House leaders from this year, we had Speaker Pro Tem Rep. Mary Lynn Magar from South Florida. We had Majority Leader Dane Eagle, who will now, this was his last year because he's running for Congress down in Southwest Florida. And our Judiciary Chairman and incoming Speaker Designate is Representative Paul Renner, and our Appropriations Chairman in the House was Rep. Travis Cummings. The more House leaders, our Ways and Means Chairman was Rep. Brian Avila. He's also from South Florida. Our Agriculture and Natural Resources Appropriations Chair was Rep. Holly Rasheen. She's from the Keys. This was also her last year. Another person termed out is Commerce Committee Chairman Mike LaRosa. He's from Central Florida. Health and Human Services Committee was led by Rep. Ray Rodriguez, who's running for Senate down in Southwest Florida, and House Minority Leader Rep. Keon McGee. And then over in the Senate, we had our President Pro Tem, Senator David Simmons. Our Appropriations Chairman was Senator Rob Bradley, whose wife is now running for his seat because he's termed out. Our Majority Leader over in the Senate and also an incoming Senate President was Senator Kathleen Passidomo. And our incoming President-designate was Senator Wilton Simpson. The Rules Committee was led by Senator Lizbeth Benequisto, and our Education Appropriations Chair was Senator Kelly Stargell. And now I will bring it back to Chris to go over the favorites.
All right. Thank you, Katie. Of course, every tournament has its favorites. These are the UNCs and the Dukes of the world. But every session also has its favorites. And so going into this year's legislative session, there were some big issues that we knew were going to be dominant. And in the course of the session, they were going to direct the way that the legislature conducted its business, did a budget, and ultimately it would affect the way the session landed this year. And so we're going to go through some of those favorites now. I'm going to take the first three, all major priorities of Governor Ron DeSantis, and all that passed in some form or another. So first, let's talk about teacher pay raises. The governor made no secret about this being his top priority for the 2020 legislative session. He started in January, going into session with a bold proposal, almost a $900 million proposal on teacher pay increases. His proposal would have allocated $600 million to starting teacher pay, and then it would have created a $300 million bonus pool for veteran teachers and other professionals in the classroom. Of course, the legislature has to balance those interests with everything else that goes into crafting a balanced state budget. And so what we ultimately saw was a compromise position. The legislature authorized a $500 million teacher pay increase package. $400 million of that is dedicated to raising the starting salary for teachers in Florida. And so that will be set at $47,500. That will be the floor for starting teachers across the state effective July 1. And then there was $100 million of the money that was also allocated to veteran teacher compensation. And so we expect that the governor will be happy with those results, all things considered in the budget this year. And so our friends in the education community will have at least that starting salary piece to look forward to. We think there will be more conversations in years to come about increasing some of the compensation for veteran teachers, administrators, and other performance measures as well. But this was a great start. The second topic that I'll handle is E-Verify. You likely saw some news about this. This was probably one of the most politically contentious bills of the session. This has been a top priority of the governor since the election 2 years ago. Last year, he was able to get the sanctuary cities ban through the legislature. And so he came back this year for the second prong of his immigration policy, which was mandatory use of E-Verify. The legislature did pass this bill, albeit again in a compromised position. And so what will be required is that all employers, public and private in the state, will have to do some form of employee eligibility check. They can do one of two systems. They can use the E-Verify system, which is you've probably heard about, and it's the federal online verification system. Or the legislature authorized a second pathway where they can continue to use the I-9 form process. In doing that, they'll have to keep I-9 records for 2 years, and that will satisfy this requirement. Notably, an early version of the bill also would have allowed the Department of Economic Opportunity to audit businesses for compliance with the mandatory use of E-Verify. That provision was stripped out towards the end of session over fears that it would turn DEO, which is an economic development agency, into a quasi-law enforcement agency. And there were some concerns about that in the legislature, so that piece was taken out. Lastly, deregulation of occupations. This has also been a priority of the governor since he took office. You may recall a deregathon that he did with agency heads and throughout the executive part of the state government earlier prior to session. And then this effort was what was needed by the legislature to help continue to deregulate occupations across the state. And so this really was an omnibus bill. It covered a wide variety of occupations, everything from architects and engineers to hair braiders, nail specialists, and beauticians. For some of those occupations, it completely deregulated the occupation. For many others, it streamlined the registration requirements, it streamlined education requirements. There were some pieces of the bill dealing with out-of-state licensure, so folks trying to come into Florida and having reciprocity for those professional licenses. And so this was a major legislative package. There's a lot to unpack here when the Department of Business and Professional Regulation starts to implement these changes. But this was also a success for the governor. This passed, and we fully expect him to sign it. With that, I'm going to hand it to my partner, Chris Carmody, who's going to take us through a few more favorites.
That deregulation bill, Dawson, was timely because if you've been keeping up with friends and family on social media, a lot of folks are practicing that barber license without it. Not looking so good for some folks out there. All right, that's my attempt to humor. Good morning, everyone in the Panhandle. Water quality, quantity, spending. From the day the governor put his hand on the Bible and got sworn in almost 2 years ago, this has been a major priority for his. If you recall, he set out that he wanted $2.5 billion over 4 years towards water quality and quantity improvements. In Florida, a lot of that was focused around Lake Okeechobee and Springs, but really it was a holistic from all the way from the top of the Panhandle down to the lower Keys approach. And this year was no different than last year. He got what he wanted. He got about $630 million-ish in the budget for water quality. So that puts him right on the trend line that he needs to be to get $2.5 billion over 4 years. So that's a win for him. Then there's Senate Bill 712, which was passed unanimously by both chambers. It's called the Clean Waterways Act. It addresses, it's a big bill. It addresses a lot of environmental issues, including provisions related to water quality improvement. I think the one takeaway is it cuts a lot of red tape as you deal with on-site sewage programs, removes Department of Health from this approval process. If you're familiar with septic, you know that the DOH, Department of Health, has to approve a lot of those upgraded septic tanks. Problem is the Department of Health and DEP, completely different animals there, and it was perceived the Department of Health was blocking a lot of innovative technologies, or maybe not blocking, just not moving them along. So they've now been cut out. It's going to hopefully move faster, and you'll have more innovative septic upgrades for all parts of the state, especially those near watersheds and springs. So that's a big win there. Moving right along, when you talk about the favorites, you have to talk about healthcare reform. Some would say this was the favorite because it was a priority of Speaker Oliva. It really held up the budget negotiations until these priorities got done. There was a package of 3 bills dealing mainly with nurses and pharmacists. The nurse piece would allow an expansion of practice. That was House Bill 607. We'll get into some of that later, but it expanded their practice to even deliver babies without doctor supervision. The other part was dealing with pharmacists in two levels. One, that pharmacists could diagnose strep or the flu with the swab test that you could have and then prescribe the drugs. And the other part would deal with managing drugs inside a hospital or other kind of healthcare facilities where the doctors aren't always on site, but you almost always have a pharmacist and a pharmacy on site that can help deal with drug management. So that was a big win. The Speaker got them, the Senate went along, it affected budget negotiations, and the governor ultimately passed those. And then the last one, dealing with the favorites, of course, was you deal with the tax cut package. Every year there's a tax cut package, as our president would say. It's a beautiful thing, the tax cut package. And this year was up until it became a very tough reality that COVID-19 was going to have a major effect on Florida's budget. Before this final package was approved, there was a business rent tax reduction. There was a communication services tax reduction. There was a number of other provisions related to the corporate income tax, dealing with brownfields and increasing the credits for that to spur on more development. However, once it passed the House and it got amended in the Senate, about a day or two passed before it was going to be ready for the Senate floor. And then the reality, as I said, set in that coronavirus was going to have a major cost to the state budget this year, maybe even next year, and they wanted to free up some money. So anything other than what you'll see in the slide here, the back-to-school sales tax holiday and the hurricane preparedness sales tax holiday, other than those 2 costs, everything else that had a major fiscal was cut out of this tax cut package. Doesn't mean it's not good policy. There's some other things in there that will help spur on some other tax areas across the state. But those some big ticket items were left on the table to make room for more funds for COVID-19 relief. And with that, we're going to jump into a couple more favorites, and I'm going to hand it over to Robert.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, everybody. Great to be with you today. We talked last year when we were together at the Gopher Club about Visit Florida, and what ultimately happened with them last year was as you may recall, a 1-year extension of Visit Florida. They were set to sunset, and the public-private partnership would have quite literally gone away from statute. Last year, they were able to implement a 1-year extension. This year, that meant that it was going to come back as another hot topic, another favorite going into the session of an item that we knew would be covered. And so the big question going into was, would it survive? And the answer was yes, it did. As the session wound to a close, Speaker Oliva, who has long been a very vocal critic of Visit Florida, had some very nice things to say about it, particularly in light of the COVID crisis and what we will need as a state to come out of that. promoting tourism, promoting that Florida beaches, Florida theme parks, Florida lakes and rivers and streams are all safe and can still be visited by tourists around the world. A 3-year extension was granted, $50 million in annual funding on a recurring basis for the next 3 years at a minimum $50 million. That's still a far cry from the $100 million that Visit Florida got about 8 or 10 years ago. But it was a very nice win, good for the tourism community, good for the Panhandle to see Visit Florida get restored. And then another one that maybe 3 or 4 months before session we didn't know was going to be a thing, turned out to be a big favorite coming into session, and that was the topic, and it's apropos of our theme here today, college athlete compensation. Following California's action, of all places, Florida decided that it was important for us to pass a law that allowed for college athletes to profit from their name, image, and likeness while enrolled in school and playing in NCAA sports. The original draft of the bill, the House's version, actually had the implementation of that bill being July 1 of 2020. As the negotiations finished at the very end of session, they decided to make it 2021, which will give the NCAA a little bit more time to come up with nationwide rules to implement this. They've signaled that they're going to do that. But the governor was very vocal in support of this, a former college athlete himself. He instituted the support of many former and current college athletes from Florida, many big names that some of you would recognize. And so this was a hot topic throughout the session and ultimately did pass with an implementation of 2021. And then moving right along, those of you who watch the NCAA tournament know that at the very end of the tournament, there is a sort of a kind of cheesy but really cool moment where all of the highlights from the tournament are bound together in one song, and Luther Vandross sings "One Shining Moment." Like the One Shining Moment in the NCAA tournament, you really can't have a tournament without that. And in Florida, you really can't have a legislative session without the budget. So we're going to talk about what's in the budget. But first, and hopefully this technology will work for us, we're going to show you the greatest One Shining Moment. And that was from 2007 when the University of Florida won its second consecutive national title over the Ohio State Buckeyes. And some of us on the call here were there for this one. It was quite a special moment. Let's hear Luther sing for us for a second.
To Ohio State basketball. For Clark, for Seth, for Sam Ryan, for all of us here at CBS Sports, I'm Greg Gumbel. Thank you for being with us. And as we say goodnight from Atlanta, it's time for a CBS tournament tradition. Luther Vandross and One Shining Moment.
Here, we'll skip up to the good part.
The national championship. And one. Oh, no one's going to catch him. Florida takes its place in history. Back to back.
I don't know about y'all, but that will never get old. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what was in the budget. Katie, you want to walk us through that? Oh, Katie, you're on mute.
Don't worry, all you missed me saying was go Knights. I didn't get too far into it. The budget that was passed this year was $93.2 billion. Of that, typically we would go into some vetoes. However, the governor has not received the budget from the legislature, so there's nothing to report about vetoes. The breakdown of that, higher education received $5.2 billion for the state university system and $207 billion for the state college system. Criminal justice received $5.6 billion. Ag and natural resources was $6.6 billion, and of that, $2.3 billion went to Florida Department of Economic Protection. The transportation and economic budget got $13.7 billion, and of that, $9.3 billion was for full funding of the Florida Department of Transportation work program. In K through 12, there was $23.5 billion in state funding. When you combine that with when you combine that with local revenues, it's 35.9. And then Health and Human Services was $39.4 billion. So with that, I will then bring it over to Chris so he can talk about some of the local things in Pensacola.
Absolutely. Thanks, Katie. And to talk about the budget, Pensacola had a great year in the state budget. And, I think I'd take this moment to say you have a fantastic delegation there in Escambia County and really throughout Northwest Florida. Of course, talking about the budget, we mentioned our good friend, Chairman GrayRobinson, chairs a budget subcommittee in the House. So he's got a good pulse on what's going on in the state budget process. Senator Doug Broxton, obviously a veteran of the process and does a fantastic job bringing home a financial victory for Northwest Florida in the state budget. And then, of course, Representative Alex Andrade, your local representative there in the downtown Pensacola area, has done a fantastic job. He's off to a great start in his legislative career as well. And he had a couple major budget bills this year I wanted to highlight since he is your representative. The first, House Bill 81, healthcare for children. What this does is finally expands Medicaid to allow school districts to tap into those resources to provide healthcare to school-age children. A no-brainer, certainly something that will be beneficial to many families across the state. The next bill also was sponsored by Representative Andrade, and it had a budget implication statewide, House Bill 101, the public construction bill. What this bill does is it reduces retainage on public construction projects to a flat 5% for the life of the project. For those of you who aren't in construction, retainage is the amount of the total cost of a project that the local government holds back on the project. So it was 10% prior to this bill. And as you can imagine, if you're a contractor or a subcontractor working on a 10 or 20 or $30 million public works project, 10% is real money. And so what this does is it infuses additional cash flow back into the contractors and subcontractors. Those of you in construction know many of whom are small businesses. And so this will be a very important bill to the construction industry. And fortuitously now, as we're looking at COVID-19, of course, and what a post-COVID-19 economy looks like, construction is going to be a huge part of that comeback. And so to have this bill on the books and have that additional cash flow is really going to be critical. I also want to take everyone through a couple of local funding priorities that were included, and we're going to breeze through these, Robert, so feel free to be quick on these. First, the Emerald Coast Utilities Authority, $250,000 for septic to sewer upgrades. Next, we've got the Escambia County, Perdido, Pensacola and Perdido Bay Estuary program. This is a water quality project. So as Chris Carmody mentioned, this plays into the governor's priority of water quality projects statewide. So $500,000 for that priority. Next, Southern Youth Sports Association Community Center Building, $300,000 for the local Southern Sports Youth Sports Association. The Bluffs entrance and transportation upgrades. Of course, this is a major economic development initiative. That project's been around, and it's great to see success again in the budget this year. $750,000 for that priority. And lastly, a local budget priority, University of Florida Lastinger Center. This is a statewide initiative to help with the Algebra Nation online platform. Of course, this plays into the STEAM emphasis in education, particularly focusing on mathematics. And so this is a great project to see funded as well. As Katie mentioned, the governor has not issued vetoes yet. So if any of those projects are important to any of you out there viewing the video, be sure to weigh in with the governor's office and let them know you support those projects and you'd like to see that money come to Northwest Florida. And with that, we're going to pivot from the budget now, and we're going to talk about a little bit more of policy that passed during this session. So I'm going to hand it over to Katie, and she's going to talk about healthcare.
All right. Thank you for that, Chris. All right. So healthcare, as you may know, was one of the biggest priorities for the Speaker of the House, Jose Oliva. Last year, he had a good year. This year, all that he had left was expanding the scope of practice. He was successful in expanding the scope for both ARNPs and pharmacists. That was sent to the governor immediately, and it was signed into law. Another healthcare issue that we saw this year was the parental consent for abortion. That was passed. It was very contentious. We certainly expected, though, to be challenged in court pretty soon. After that, I will give it to Chris Carmody for growth management.
Thank you, Katie. Well, in the last 2 years, you've seen a focus at the legislative level on making some reforms to growth management. Some of this is driven by Florida is doing well economically. Obviously, this is pre the flash recession we're in the moment, and they wanted to find ways to keep it going. And part of that, too, was it was the perception that at the local government level, these governments were coming out of the recession from '08, still hadn't staffed up their building departments and to review permits, do inspections, what have you. And there was a perceived lag behind at the local government. And quite frankly, that's more of a anecdotal type thing. What some local governments might do doing well in the Panhandle doesn't necessarily mean they're doing well in another part of the state, and where they're doing well doesn't mean they're doing well the same thing well in another part of the state. So they try to do a one size fits all across the state. But as you can see in this slide, we only put 6 bullets up, and this was a fairly large bill. There was a couple growth management bills that made it through, some dealing with affordable housing that I'll touch on, that put linkage fees in there and restricted linkage fees if the local government requires it, that you have to fully offset the cost on affordable housing if you require linkage fees. There's others that did some things for permitting that was really for home builders. But this slide is really from Senate Bill 410 that dealt with local comp plans. There's a property rights element included in this bill that requires when a local government adopts a comp plan that they have to respect someone's property rights in doing so. And what that means in a nutshell is if you've got a property that's ag, or if it's a property that's commercial or residential, and they do a comp plan, well, they can't just right next door to you put a commercial if you're residential or vice versa without taking into consideration what effect that's going to have on your property. So some of that makes sense, but you'd be surprised. There's some jurisdictions where that's not necessarily the case. That second bullet, I'll point it out because it's going to make for some interesting politics, I know, in our team's backyard, but in other parts, it says essentially that if a city, municipality adopts, if a county has a overarching comp plan code provision, whether it's dealing with urban and rural boundaries or some other kind of things with setbacks or with homes, if a city has a different policy, the county policy won't win the day unless the city has adopted by a vote, by referendum, that same type of policy. Well, why is that relevant? Well, if you have an unincorporated area of a county that's maybe, let's say, rural boundary type area where it's meant to be more woods, more setbacks, more berms, and then a city just incorporates that whole area and adopts a different plan, you're going to have a major shift in that part of your community. So that was something that was adopted. That's kind of controversial, and there's folks pushing the governor to veto. As you can see, any county that's 750,000 citizens or more are exempt. So just think your large counties in Central Florida, over in the Tampa area, and South Florida and Duval this wouldn't apply to. And then as you can see going through the rest of this slide, there's stuff dealing with permit applications for utilities. No surprise there. The utility companies are always looking for ways to improve their ability to do business. And then the fourth bullet that deals with successors of interest. You heard some stories across the state of someone would buy a piece of property that's part of a development order, and then all of a sudden they couldn't do much with that land. They wanted to change it, but because the development agreement had certain things in place, they couldn't do it without getting a whole lot of levers pulled at the local level. This allows them to pull out of whatever that previous use was, so long as it does not directly modify the allowable uses or entitlements of other owners' property. So that's probably a good win for property rights and what have you. There's a lot of them in there. If you have questions at the end or later, feel free to email us and we can go over those for you. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Robert to talk about everyone's favorite piece of legislation, one we love working on. Who doesn't love a good license plate bill?
Thank you, Chris. So for the last 10 years or so, the legislature has tried in vain to pass a new specialty license plate bill that would both create new plates and also establish a regulatory framework for how plates are created and how many plates there are in Florida at any given time. Every year it passes the House. Every year it dies on the final day in the Senate. And it looked for a time like that was going to be the exact same fate this year, but they were able to get it across the finish line. And so some new plates that you're going to see on the roadways are things like out-of-state universities. So Auburn, Georgia, Alabama, and some others will have out-of-state license plates, and that money will be dedicated for certain purposes. Give Kids the World is a local nonprofit in the Central Florida area. That's one that we happen to work on That'll be a new plate. The Divine Nine, which is the historically black fraternities and sororities, they've gotten plates now. And then the new structure that's in place is that there's a cap of 150 plates statewide. And as plates begin to go under a certain threshold of sales, 3,000 is the number annually. If you go under that threshold for a 12-month period, your plate is taken out of circulation and a new one is brought in. And that's the way they'll keep new plates getting into circulation while also maintaining a cap. So there will be some more when you go to your DMV to renew your tag. If any of you still go in to do that, you'll have lots of options for new tags as the years go on. But they finally got this done, which probably means that license plates for the next several years in Tallahassee will not be much of a topic.
Now, Rob, you buried the lead here before you go on. You know, Pensacola is LA, as Dawson has told me a couple times. Were there a couple plates that maybe not all these non-Gator fans might like in there?
Yeah, so like I was mentioning, Auburn, Alabama, Georgia universities will all have plates. So for all you Bammers up there, you've got options now beyond just Florida State, and UCF. So
I didn't know Auburn fans could drive, Robert. So I don't know what to do with those plates. On a donkey.
I'll let you guys up there deal with that. But moving right along to some of the preemption issues, every single year, and we talked about this last year with you guys, there are dozens of preemption bills that are filed in Tallahassee, and those bills would, of course, preempt local governments on certain things, sort of a state knows best type mentality. And local governments, all things considered, had a really good year this year on preemption issues. So vacation rental preemption is dead. Local occupational licenses, dead. Building design, dead. Retainage reduction, Chris talked about that. That's one that did pass, but one that local governments really didn't fight much. They understood that there needed to be sort of a reset in that market. The biggest one for local governments this year going into it was a reduction or reform of the communication services tax, which would have been some of the initial versions of that bill would have been a massive impact to local government revenues. That died. And then one where local governments and private industry sort of came together in a really neat way was the continuing services contracts increase. So taking from $2 million to $4 million, the amount that local governments and government entities can spend on soft services, construction, something that needed to be moved up, hadn't been moved in about a decade, that got increased. So that was a nice win for local governments as well. And you can't have an NCAA tournament without some Cinderella stories. It happens every year, other than this year, of course. And that's no different in the legislative session. There are issues, the ones we'll run through on these next few slides, are issues that nobody saw coming, or very few people saw coming, that ended up dominating a lot of time and attention in the legislative session.
Thanks, Robert. I'll kick this off. You may have seen in the news an issue that arose during session and really kind of evolved into a scandal was the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And there are some allegations of misappropriation of state funds there. The legislature broke this issue and then had several committee topics on it. They issued subpoenas and ultimately dug in and found about $7.5 million of almost entirely state funds that were paid out to this organization's CEO. There are ongoing inquiries into this, but really, I think the headline, beyond just the sad situation there, is the impact that this is going to have on some other nonprofits and really the good actors across the state are going to get wrapped into this as we see more audit requirements and things like that coming down the pipe. This is an issue that won't go away. It did get a little bit cut off when COVID-19 was growing as an issue, but behind the scenes, this is continuing to shape the way that the state is going to interact with some of their nonprofit providers. And so that's definitely going to be one to watch, particularly if you're in that space. University takeovers. I don't think any of us here would have suggested at the beginning of session we were going to be talking about reducing the number of universities in the state, but the Florida House of Representatives had other plans. And so really almost in the middle of the night, a proposal was put out that would have consolidated the state university system from 12 institutions back down to 10, notably New College of Florida and Florida Polytechnic University in Lakeland were on the block to be merged back into the state flagship institutions, UF and FSU. The impetus for the plan was those two institutions, again, New College and Florida Polytechnic, They have the highest cost per diploma in the state. And the legislature took or the House at least, took a position that perhaps there would be more economies if those were folded back into some of the bigger institutions with a lower cost per diploma ratio. The Senate ultimately did not go along with this proposal, though there were some serious conversations that took place. And so this is an issue that may be looked at more holistically in a future session. With that, Chris mentioned earlier he was going to take on and discuss with you all affordable housing. And so I'm going to pass the ball over to Chris.
You know, in those first two topics, you almost could call them upsets, which every tournament expects, something that just completely out of left field and then it goes away. Affordable housing, this is your Cinderella story. This is a 12 seed that just kept moving its way through the bracket. Anyone who follows this knows that pre-session, the last 10 years, the House and Senate have collectively swept the Sadowski Trust Fund to pay for general revenue purposes in the budget. In their defense, there's about 10 to 15 trust funds that get swept every single year. This one was just the one that drew the most attention because of Florida's current struggles in affordable housing. Going into this session, if you polled the four lobbyists you see on this panel and others in the industry, we've all said, yeah, there might be some money that goes into it. Maybe some focus on the panhandle because of Hurricane Michael, but don't expect it fully funded. And then lo and behold, Cinderella got her glass slipper. $350 million for sale and ship funds, and then as well, on top of that, not dipping into the trust fund, the legislature also added $20 million additional dollars for Hurricane Michael relief in the affordable housing space that deals with repairs, maintenance, what have you. So a huge win across the board there. Dealing with constitutional amendments, this is an issue that folks didn't expect this session. They did some stuff last year that tinkered with how you get a petition amendment pushed through, but Senate Bill 1794 by Senator Hudson, it passed. We expect it'll be signed. The main change is it provides a private cause of action for a citizen to challenge a petitioner. If you ever walked into a Walmart, Target, or a grocery store and someone hands you that petition form and says, do you want to sign it for whatever? You ever wonder if they're registered or they're valid or what have you? Well, the legislature certainly has their doubts. And because if you didn't know, you actually have to register. The person who runs the company has to make sure each person's registered to go collect your signatures. It's largely believed to cut costs because you don't have to do background checks, what have you. A lot of these folks aren't registered. So now, if you sign this or potentially sign this, you now have an opportunity to have a private cause of action, which you can bet on it. There will be people who do this. The other thing is it makes it a little harder to get that judicial review. If you know, you always hear the headline when a big amendment like the one dealing with primaries and open primaries gets a certain amount of signatures, the Supreme Court reviews it and says if the language passes muster or not. Typically, before it was you only needed to be a quarter of the congressional districts across the state have the certain signatures that you need to. Now it's actually 50% of the congressional districts you need to have that threshold, and it raises the number of signatures. The reason this is important is because a lot of these amendments, they have their own seed funding. And then once they pass the constitutional muster of the Supreme Court, then they get a lot more national money coming in to support these plans. Think of the felon voting rights issue. That was something that had a lot of local and regional money. And then once it got constitutional muster and passed, a lot of federal money, not federal dollars, but meaning money from across the other 49 states came in from private donors to help support it. This makes it a little harder to get that review, which in theory would make it harder for you to get to that finish line. So pay attention to that one because it has an effect immediately on this cycle, but will also have a major effect on the 2022 cycle. And then as well, sovereign immunity cap. So this is something, if you're familiar with it, if a local government is sued for a tort, the most that you can collect from local government right now is $200,000 or $300,000, depending on if it's economic damages or pain, suffering, what have you. What was proposed in the Senate, and it got heard in a committee, was raising that cap all the way to $1 million. What ultimately happened is it was amended down to $500,000, and then the bill died because the House didn't sponsor it. But this is coming back. Now, presently, you say, well, 200, 300, that's not a lot. Then you have to go through what they call the claim bill process at the legislative level, where it has to be approved by the House, the Senate, and ultimately by the governor. And it's very difficult to get through that process. And anyone who's in the process, to a T, hates the process. They just don't like claim bills. They think they're difficult. They think they don't have good results. But both of you don't want to pay, and if you do want to pay, it's a messy process. So this was hopefully going to clean that up. Pushed by the trial bar, didn't go across the finish line naturally. anyone who's anti-trial bar, and especially local governments who would have had a major cost if this went up, fought this. It will be back next year, so this is sort of a coming attractions and a Cinderella story because we didn't expect it. And now Robert's going to talk about newspaper notices. You're probably familiar with that. If you want to get something done, they have to publish it in a newspaper.
Yeah, a couple more Cinderella stories to walk through and this is one that has, for the last, as long as I can remember, filed every year, but never really gets much traction. Sometimes the House will move it, at least through a committee or two, but the Senate never picks it up. This year, the bill got incredibly strong traction in the House, passing all the way through the Florida House of Representatives, made it through a couple committees in the Senate, but didn't make it all the way to the finish line. And what it would do is pretty simple. It would remove the requirements or significantly scale them back to post legal notices for government action in the local daily paper. That's something that in many ways keeps our newspapers afloat right now, particularly newspapers that are struggling, because the local governments, the government entities around that newspaper are statutorily required to buy an ad and post their legal notice in the paper. With the obviously move, we're all talking together today on a computer. With the rise of the technology age that we're in, there has been an interest, particularly on the House's side, in having that move more electronic. Email postings, website postings, getting the word out about legal notices in local government action, but doing it in a way that's far more cost effective for the local governments. Obviously, the newspapers hate this because it's a stream of revenue for them, and so this is one that you're going to see coming back and forth over the next couple of years. But it did get more traction than usual, so keep an eye on that. Another is alcohol freedom. Our team's favorite topic is booze, and hopefully many of you feel the same way, particularly in these uncertain times. And it's, in fact, in my house, it's almost happy hour. So as soon as we hang up, we'll be pouring our first one for the day. But every last several years, there's been a movement towards more freedom for our local breweries, our craft distilleries, our craft wineries. And there was a omnibus bill that the House did pass this year. The Senate ultimately didn't take it up. But there does appear to be more interest and support for this type of thing in the Senate in the years ahead. But the bill would have done a bunch of things, everything from being allowed to bring your dog into the brewery when you want to go have a cold one, to loosening regulations on craft distilleries, allowing them to sell drinks by the glass, joint marketing between retailers and manufacturers, retailers and manufacturers, bypassing the distributor level of the three-tier system, and something as simple as the wine size limitation. In Florida law, many of you probably don't know this, there are 3 sizes in which you can buy a bottle of wine. And if you buy or sell in anything other than those 3 sizes, you're committing a crime. Removing that wine size has long been a priority of Speaker Oliva and others in the House, who just see it as an archaic, unnecessary burden to freedom. So be on the lookout for more of that in the future as well. Another one, this is a Cinderella story. The transportation bill was actually sponsored by your local rep, Representative Andrade. Not a Cinderella story because they filed it. They file it every single year, but Cinderella story because it almost passed. And passing one 2 years in a row, they were able to move one last year, would have been unheard of. The transportation bill usually passes every 2, 3, 4 years. And so the fact that they almost got one done again this year was pretty notable. You expect a lot of this good policy to come back. It's things that are important to the Department of Transportation. And we'll talk a little bit about special session later, but I think you could see some of this type of transportation policy even pass in a special session as they're expediting projects, moving things quicker throughout the state during this time where we have less traffic. Tourist development tax, one more to mention, and then I'll pass it on, was changes to the TDT. The House, Brian Avila from Miami, chair of the Ways and Means Committee, was incredibly passionate about changing the way that TDT taxes are distributed, the way that they can be spent, largely arising out of concerns that he has in Miami. But you can't change some of the TDT without making it a change statewide. Ultimately, the Senate did not go along with this, and there were really no changes to the TDT as a result. One very small tweak that was specific to Lee County, but otherwise no changes to TDT. And that money, once it starts to flow again, when visitors come back to our state, will be able to be used for the exact same purposes, namely tourism promotion, as it has been in the past. Katie, a couple more, and then we'll be ready to talk about special session and answer any questions that you've got.
All right, our final Cinderella stories, and I'll try to keep it short and sweet for everybody. Commercial airport changes. This is not a bill that we expected to see this year. However, there was an issue down in Miami, and the local representative and senator filed a bill, and this deals with general transparency at the procurement and board levels for airports, and this ended up passing through. The next bill is school board term limits. That bill you're likely familiar with as it gets filed most years. It did not pass this session, but as school board term limits right now do not exist. So there is a bill that keeps being filed to create some. We'll definitely see that again next year. And finally, the THC cap on medical marijuana. There is not much to explain on that one, but that bill did not make it. And then I will pass it over to Chris Carmody for some summer madness.
So you hear a lot in the papers and on the blogs and certainly on the Twitter and what have you, where they talk about state politics, legislative session, that there could be a special session and because of COVID-19. Here's what we know. President Galvano in the Senate, he released a memo about 2 weeks ago discussing the current economic outlay, what the revenue estimators are seeing, what his prospects are. And a couple of things to take into mind. There's going to be a new revenue estimation that's going to come out this month. There'll be one later at the end of this quarter. And it seems as if the Senate and the House hasn't said anything, so I would assume they would go along with it. Speaker Lee is usually quick to openly disagree if he actually does disagree with the president on something. Is that they're gonna wait until July 1, the actual fiscal year, to start to do any kind of changes. Now, why is that? Obviously, our state budget's taking a hit because of COVID-19. There's less sales tax being generated. People aren't coming here for tourism. There's people aren't going to the bricks and mortar stores except for your grocers and some of your big stores for supplies that you need. That is all true. However, they have about $4 billion in reserves based on the budget stabilization fund, some unallocated funds that they had, and in the Lot and Child's Endowment Fund that makes up that $4 billion. And if you paid attention to the CARES Act at the federal level, Florida is set to get about $9 billion of unrestricted funds to deal with coronavirus relief. Now, that's the only restriction on it, and I'll get into that. Of those funds, about 45% are going to go to local governments that have 500,000 or more citizens. So think Duval, Orange County, Hillsborough County, Pasco County area down in South Florida. But after that 45% is taken up, the state's still going to have about $5 billion to use. And that's not counting for the education funds that are coming down the pike from the federal program, for the hospital funds, and a few other buckets that are coming in. There is some discussion that the feds are going to let the states use that for budget stabilization. If Florida can tap into that $5 billion, there's no question our budget will be stabilized unless this recession truly goes into the fall where we're still at home. Now, if that's the case, obviously all bets are off. So what they're looking to do is sometime in the next fiscal year, July, August timeframe, is actually come in for a special session, allocate those federal funds appropriately. Some will also go at the local level. By the way, those funds were not just for the 500,000 or more, they're meant for any local government. So if you're in local government and watching this, folks, obviously make sure they're tracking what they're spending to deal with coronavirus, whether that's upgrading their virtual workspace to help get things done or actually dealing with testing and what have you at the local level. But pay attention to that. So that second bullet, that was a long way to set up a special session, but it's irrelevant. The second bullet deals with the Seminole Gaming Compact. There's two policy issues that have tax implications and revenue that we believe will be on the table if and when they have a special session. One is the Seminole Gaming Compact. For the last 2 years, the Seminoles have not paid the $300+ million to the state that's required in the compact because courts have determined that the state violated the compact by letting certain pari-mutuel facilities offer blackjack. The Seminoles, without paying that money, have been pushing the state to renegotiate the compact. They want to add more games to the table and allow sports betting. It's largely believed that sports betting was not a problem on this issue. It was just some of the expansion of other games. And apparently they came very close to passing a deal this year. That's $300 million. The guaranteed money of the new deal is anywhere between $500 and $700 million. If you have $750 million that the state can count on with the new deal, these legislators are going to take a long, hard look at that. And during a special session, we'd expect that. as well. 3 weeks ago, I bet the state sure wished they had an online sales tax because they don't, as you all know. They have a bricks and mortar physical sales tax. That one thing that was working this year but didn't quite get to the finish line was having an online sales tax. I fully expect in a special session someone will push for this issue. It may not get done in this special session, but they're looking at it in future years because it's estimated anywhere between 3 and 500 million is in online sales tax that the state does not collect because it's from an Etsy dealer or someone that doesn't have a presence, otherwise has a presence in Florida. And it's probably a lot more now that the state is essentially shut down. So pay attention to those issues. We don't expect it until sometime Q4 of this year, or excuse me, Q3 of this year, but sometime in the new fiscal year, July 1 to September timeframe. But pay attention to those. And Chris, I believe I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of go over questions and do a little bit of housekeeping and announcements.
Yes, thank you, Chris. And we do have an option for questions. I'm not sure if we have any, but we'll get that instruction here momentarily. Some of you may have taken Robert's invitation to go ahead and start happy hour, which we fully support. It is 5 o'clock somewhere. So do we have any questions, Lee? No questions. So we are good to go to bring it in for a landing. And so with that, thank you all very much for your time today to join us. We want to thank Todd, Sarah, and Liko with the Chamber. They've done a fantastic job setting this up. We always love doing this, and we look forward to being back, hopefully in person, with you all next year in Pensacola. And as I conclude, one more plug. The Chamber this year had the first Northwest Florida Days in Tallahassee. As you've seen from all of these issues, there's a lot going on. It directly impacts Northwest Florida. And so the Chamber, I think, has done a fantastic job taking up that project of bringing folks, leaders to Tallahassee. I'd encourage you next year, please join that effort. It really is a presence is power in Tallahassee. And so we'd love to see you all there. The legislative session will kick off in March of next year. And then, of course, we hope to be back with you guys again in May for a 2021 session recap. So with that, thank you all and have a fantastic day.
Thank you for joining us for our virtual legislative wrap-up. Special thanks goes out to GrayRobinson and their team for bringing us the latest updates on Florida's legislative session and how it affects our local communities and businesses. Also, thanks to Centennial Bank for making this event possible. For more information about the Pensacola Chamber, visit pensacolachamber.com.